I should say at the start that thanks for the detailed description of VTAC too. It's more than just me. I am one of the directors of VTAC, and I guess our frustration was not so much that other groups weren't doing enough, but that they weren't providing opportunities for everyday people to do something. You know, that was our frustration at the time. So I thought I'd start a little bit about saying my path getting here tonight. Rosemary asked me to talk about this. When my wife and I started our family, we thought a lot about, we actually took a lot of pleasure in things like insulating our house and upgrading our furnace and, getting rid of our car and taking the bus and riding our kids around on our bikes. But, as I kept abreast of the news, I came to realize that, how far am I going to take this? I could sit on my hands in the dark, and it wouldn't make a difference if Stephen Harper expanded the tar sands, if he reneged on his climate commitments, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't enough. So that's really why we started VTAC. Sorry, a little housekeeping for me too. I ran through this today out loud, and I totally got a croaky voice. Okay, I'll try that out too. So I'm going to drink a lot of water tonight. And I'm also going to read some of this fairly closely because these are important topics, and I don't want to miss the point. I don't want to lose my point. Can you hear me now? Is this? This is going to be tough. You'll have to tell me constantly to raise it up to my mouth too. So I want to start today. Hopefully this works. Oops, sorry. That didn't work. I'm going to back up to the start of that because something's gone wrong. Okay, there we go. It's because it's not on the screen that it's not doing it. Okay. So I want to start today with a photo, thank you, whoever turned that up, of my kids. Because like all kids, and I think whole families in many parts of the world, they haven't done a thing to deserve the world that we're handing over to them. It really is a miracle to me that we're here right now, that we can talk and have a conversation. Bruce sang when he used to be with his church, he said, we're the universe conscious of itself. And that's true, and it's amazing. And what's more, we live in a world that can completely provide for us. It's a gift, and we're screwing it up. And I'm angry to think that my children's future will be vastly tougher than ours right now, than our lives right now. And that our actions are causing suffering for other people in the world right now. So I think I have an obligation to do what I can to prevent that suffering or prevent more suffering. But I've also put these photos up for another reason. My son's taller than me now. He's number 33 on the left there. And it is a moral obligation, but really what are we fighting for? Why do we do any of this stuff? And I'd say because I think it's a joy to be alive. Because there's real pleasure in other people's company and in going to basketball games and in working together and trying to take care of each other. And I want to keep that going. It turns out that this is Rosemary's niece. I didn't know that. She was at White Rock at that event. I thought a lot lately about how we reconcile what I think is our extremely dire situation with getting up and going to work every day, about what it means to be human and taking responsibility for our obligations to our kids and to each other and to the earth. And to be honest, like Rian said, I'd have to describe this as a bit of a grieving process for me and a reconciliation. And I really appreciate the chance to talk tonight because it's given me a chance to sharpen my own thinking about this stuff. It's something I thought about for a long time since we started VTAC, but really I never speak about it out loud except to my wife, who's telling me right now how to raise and lower the microphone, which is this is really handy. Slow down, not lower the microphone. So anyways, I'm really glad to be able to offer up my own process and what I've thought through for your consideration tonight. Usually when I talk, it's about the particulars of trying to stop a single coal port. And I relate that to the bigger picture only in sort of one or two sentences in the whole talk. But tonight I want to talk just about the bigger picture openly and honestly, because and I'm actually uncomfortable up here doing this because I think the facts that we're facing are really brutal. And it really kind of goes against human nature to speak in extremes, because extremes must be bad, right? Well, in this case, they're not. They're true. And if we don't face them, we're not going to truly know what it means to confront these issues. And like some of you probably, I know there's people here I recognize from events and people that I've worked with and are grappling with these issues, it's getting harder and harder just to go along for the ride without speaking out. I don't have all the answers, but I'm ready to ask the questions, and I think we need to be curious about that and open to it. So, an overview of what I'll say in the next half an hour. How bad is it? And when we sort that out, what's the appropriate response? Is it hope? Is it despair? Is it acceptance? And then how do we live? I want to talk about virtuous behavior and collective action and different kinds of behavior. And then finally, what does that mean for dealing with fossil fuel exports in BC? So, oh dear, this is a problem if you go the wrong way. To keep it on top. How bad is it? I think this graph really sums it up. The blue line is a compilation of various sources, historical sources. The red line is a compilation of various projections. The blue line is 10,000 years. That's all of human civilization. That's all of agriculture, all of cities, all of specialization. And the red line is business as usual. The red line is the end of organized society if we don't get off this path. Which brings us to the first sort of general point that I want to make. Climate change is already happening, and for many of you, this won't be a surprise. We're already headed up towards that red line. And the question is, how does it manifest itself in the world? Well, let's just run through some of those to ground ourselves in the conversation. It begins with extreme heat in many parts of the world already. In Australia, in Europe, it's incredible wildfires in Australia and Russia and in the US West. It's unprecedented drought. And again, in Australia, in the Middle East, and in the US as well. This is Lake Mead near Las Vegas, Nevada, which has gone down 100 feet since 2000. This supplies a lot of the drinking water to the southwestern United States, to agriculture, to the food that we buy. Arctic sea ice is melting faster than anyone really predicted would happen. We're way ahead of the curve on many of these impacts. Flooding in Europe, extreme weather in many parts of the world, hurricanes in North America, typhoons in Asia, all bringing intense suffering. Even the jet stream, even the upper air currents have now moved because of unprecedented warming in the north, making it paradoxically cold in the south, further south. The Greenland ice sheet melting way faster than expected, and at one point last year, the entire surface of the ice sheet virtually was in a melting pattern. And in fact, as this planet-wide experiment goes on, we're learning that impacts are happening faster than expected at temperatures lower than expected. And where we thought before that 2 degrees Celsius was the trade-off between acceptable and dangerous climate change, we're learning now that 1 degree Celsius is the trade-off between acceptable and dangerous climate change. And it's not just about the weather. As we put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it dissolves in the oceans, it acidifies them, and that's happening right here in BC. 3 years worth of scallops just died for island scallops in Qualicum Bay. And the owner of the company says, he actually monitors the pH in the water there. He says, I'm convinced the ocean is getting much more acidic and much faster than anyone anywhere believed could happen. I think he's right. Pine beetle, encouraged by warmer winters, has devastated our forests, turning them from carbon sinks that absorb carbon into carbon sources that emit carbon into the atmosphere. It's a vicious cycle because as the forests die, they burn and it's more carbon in the atmosphere and so on. Climate change, oops, sorry, let me back up to that. Climate change is also obviously stressing food production, and there's direct connection between food costs and social unrest. There's a clear pattern of connections there, and social unrest around the world is related to higher food costs. Climate change has played a huge role in the breakdown of organized society in the Horn of Africa because it's one of the areas that's been hit earliest and hardest by climate change in terms of drought, disrupted weather patterns, and so on. So that's a quick summary of some of the main, I wouldn't call them highlights, but points of where we're at with climate change right now. It's not heartening, and people are already suffering all over the world. For the most part, the people that haven't even caused the problems. That's neither fair nor just, and it's ironic that here we are, one of the biggest emitters per capita in the world, and we will likely suffer the impacts latest. But unfortunately, bad enough as that is, climate change is going to get worse. Further change is inevitable because the residence time of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere means that even if we were to stop releasing emissions now entirely, the Earth would continue to warm for some time. So we've raised the temperature of the Earth probably a degree, and even if we stopped releasing emissions now, it would go up to 1.5 degrees higher than pre-industrial temperatures. And of course, emissions aren't stopping going up. We've just passed a really significant milestone, 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, against the normal background of about 280. We know that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere now are higher than they've been in at least 650,000 years and possibly in several million years. And because carbon dioxide tracks so closely with temperature, we know the last time there was this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the Earth was considerably hotter than it is now. It was a much hotter place. Unfortunately, even the rate at which we're putting it into the atmosphere is going up. So not only is there more, it's going up faster. We're completely going in the wrong directions on all these points. Sorry, this is backwards. And despite what the graphs show, there's a strong possibility that these changes in the future won't follow these smooth lines. It may not be a steady up escalator of warmer temperatures and stormier weather and worse droughts, but that will pass thresholds that cause us to flip into completely new, less hospitable states. I want to talk briefly about the political and institutional response to climate change, this notion that we have a commitment to keeping temperatures below, the temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius, which corresponds to 450 parts per million of climate change. We now know that that target, as we talked about, is inadequate because impacts are happening earlier than expected. And in fact, a good way to look at the scale of work we face to try and meet that 2-degree target, just to give us a sense of how immense it is the notion of a carbon budget. So the central circles are all the fossil fuel reserves in the world that we could possibly dig up and burn. The smaller circles, that's coal and oil and gas. The smaller circles on the left are how much we can burn based on what we know carbon dioxide is to the atmosphere to try and stay below that 2-degree level, which already is not that safe. This is between 2000 and 2050. So the small black circle is what we've already burned, and the larger gray circle is what is left that we could burn and still stay below that 2-degree level. Okay, and that's from all sources. That's not just from that gray circle includes agriculture and deforestation and all those things, not just fossil fuels. That's how much emissions we can produce in total. So here comes the tough math. That 565 gigatons, which is a gigaton is 1 billion tons, divided into 40 years, is only 14 gigatons a year. In 2011, from burning fossil fuels alone, we released 33 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And these numbers are, the carbon tracker numbers are widely supported. That 860 gigaton figure is sort of accepted. So, and even if you assume there's some margin of error there, I think it's safe to say that our chance of reducing emissions enough to stay below 2 degrees Celsius is virtually impossible. You know, it would take an unprecedented level of commitment on our part to do that. And Pete McMartin is, oops, that didn't work from this end. Pete McMartin is right to say that we're facing some serious deadlines, and we clearly need to commit to a crash course in planned austerity and a global commitment to degrowth now if we're going to have any chance of staying below a 2-degree increase. But consider, I mean, I'm sure most of this is pretty obvious to all of you. Consider for a second how government works and the media works and what a lot corporations have on our society, and you can see that this isn't likely to happen. So we've likely blown past this 2-degree deadline, and now we're now facing some much more serious deadlines and thresholds. And this is where things get really worrying, if they're not already. Because the gulf between the warning signs and the alarm bells and the frenetic effort to expand the extraction and export and burning of fossil fuels grows ever wider. I just want to run through a few people who are talking about this right now because to me it's when you see it all together, it's really compelling. The head of the UN, climate change is an existential challenge for the whole human race. The Secretary of State of the United States, the costs of inaction grow beyond anything that anyone of the conscience or common sense should be willing to contemplate. The head of the International Monetary Fund, the world is perilously close to climate change tipping points and the impacts will be merciless. The World Bank, which is talking about the risks of reaching a 4-degree temperature increase, they're saying it would be a climate catastrophe that simply must not be allowed to occur. At a 4-degree increase, people say that there could be up to a 40% reduction in food production. And that's not just from drought, that's from an increase in temperature alone. And there's no certainty that a 4-degree increase in temperature is anything stable, that it simply would stop there, that it wouldn't trigger those thresholds that take us into whole new realms of disaster. We don't want to go there. We just don't want to go there. And the International Energy Agency says that we're going to be there by 2035 on our current path if we don't change what we're doing. And in fact, the IEA says that we're on track to a 6-degree warmer world, which is 6-degree average over the planet and not in cities. Some cities will be 12 degrees warmer. So imagine taking the subway in New York when it's 45 degrees out. It's not going to happen. The International Energy Agency says that everybody, even the school children, knows that this is a catastrophe for all of us. The US military knows that it's a catastrophe, and their chief of Pacific Forces says that climate change is an accelerant to instability and the most likely thing to cripple the security environment. Even, I'll wrap this up quickly, even Nicholas Stern, who wrote the famous 2006 report on the costs of taking action, not taking action, I was wrong and I should have been more blunt. It's much worse than I thought. So despite all these alarm bells, the IEA again does all sorts of analysis. We are surely on track to locking in all those changes in terms of building enough coal ports and enough oil pipelines and enough power plants that we will have built all the infrastructure needed to guarantee we put enough pollution in the atmosphere to go past any safe level of return. This is written in 2011, and it was saying that in 5 years, we would be past that point of no return. That's 2016. The IEA now says that to have any reasonable chance of avoiding a disaster, 2/3 of all fossil fuels have to stay in the ground. And that actually breaks down into 2/3 of oil and gas, and then 4/5 of all coal need to stay in the ground to have a reasonable chance of avoiding disaster. Not a certain chance, but a reasonable chance. So clearly what we need now is, we've all heard this, a World War II level mobilization of resources focused on nothing other than reducing emissions as quickly as possible, getting off of fossil fuels. And yet, here we are arguing over proposals to expand fossil fuel exports, arguing over or fighting over efforts to increase emissions. This is from the Sightline Institute in Seattle, and it's a summary of all the coal, oil, and gas export plans in the US and Canadian, in the Northwest. So these are proposed increases in emissions, nearly a gigaton of that global carbon budget right here in our region. And just for comparison, this is all of BC's emissions domestically, this is all of Alberta's emissions, and this is all the emissions that would be created from the oil that would be shipped through the Keystone XL pipeline if that was built. So we're sitting on a powder keg right here in BC. I'll return to the specifics of our region in a bit, but for now I just want to say that I think the main takeaway is that, as Chris Hedges says, the power elites are not behaving rationally. I've been in meetings where people have said things not unlike what this guy's saying. Can everyone read that? I can read it if they can't. I've been in meetings where people have said, yes, we need to take climate change seriously, but let's not send the wrong message by saying no to coal exports. We've got to let people know that BC is still open for business. There's a complete disconnect between where we're going and this fossil fuel economy, which is why one of our main focuses in VTAC is trying to connect those dots. So where we are now, where we're going, a quick sum up. I think if we're really honest with ourselves, our situation is dire. Our governments don't appear to have the courage to face up to this problem, and if we don't act now, it's only going to get harder to hold on to a just and fair society where we can take care of each other. We're going to be struggling to survive if we don't work now. Because these changes that are happening are essentially permanent. The carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere for a long time, and those temperatures aren't going to decline if we stop releasing emissions. Where we stop, they gradually rise until we fill out that lag time, and then we're stuck there. So that's where we're at. The question that follows, naturally, is, what do we do? And more often than not, it boils down to, is there any hope? You'd be surprised how many things you read that say, is there any hope? It's almost a tenet that if you talk about this stuff, if you actually stare this in the face, that you need to leave people with a message of hope. And Michael Nelson, in an essay in this book that I'm going to mention, Moral Ground, he says it's pretty much it's an utterance of seemingly obligatory expectation. This reflex to offer hope is understandable, but I think it's simply the wrong question to ask in our situation. It's the wrong language to apply to our problem. Here's what I think is the problem with hope, as I understand it. It's external, and it applies a lack of agency. It's a desire for a future without the power to obtain it. Somebody will do something, they'll invent a new technology, somehow we'll muddle through. I think we need to set aside the language of hope, because hope is rooted in a sense of powerlessness. Hope is something we should leave for discussions about the weather. I hope it'll be sunny tomorrow, because I have no control over whether the sun is out or it's cloudy. If you saw Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, you may recall, for some reason, this scene really stuck in my head. He talks about people who, when they are finally exposed to, or finally are willing to, or for whatever reason finally grasp the seriousness of climate change, go immediately from denial to despair. As if they're, when they look it in the face, they can't handle it, and they're overwhelmed by fear, and they lapse into despair. And that's obviously not a useful reaction to have. But I think that lapsing into hope isn't any better, because they're both equally passive responses. They're fleeing into despair or fleeing into blind hope. People use this expression, this Buddhist expression, that hope and fear chase each other's tails. And I think that's really a valid comment. There's another essay, and I'm going to leave all these on at the end if you want to think about them, because to me they're very useful for clarifying my thinking. A person named Alder Stone writes in an essay that our response to the seriousness of climate change is not unlike our response to other major crises, and it can be mapped out on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model of the 5 stages of grief from her book on death and dying. Now, we all know about denial in this case, and anger is obviously something I've felt and other people feel too. I really think that bargaining, is akin to hope in this scenario, and depression is obviously like despair. Now, things are more complicated than this model, and we go up and down between all those stages, and it's not a linear process. But I really think when we've stared climate change in the face, and we've gotten past denial, and we've acknowledged that despair and hope are both too passive a response, what comes next? And that's when I think where we need to start talking about acceptance. Accepting our situation as it is so that we can get on with the work that needs to be done, with being human in this new kind of world that we face, because this world is coming to us whether we want it or not. So what is acceptance of climate change? A fellow named Roy Scranton wrote what I think is a very important essay in the New York Times, in the title, Learning How to Die in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene being the world right now, this sort of phase of geological history where humans are a major force. We're melting ice caps, we're raising sea levels, as if we're shifting the Earth closer to the sun by making it warmer. We're a force to be reckoned with. Now, so Scranton in this essay compares, he was a Marine in Iraq, and he compares the chaos that he faced every day there, starting every day with accepting the possibility of his own death so that he could get on with the work he needed to do as a soldier, and living that life with the chaos he saw upon return when he was redeployed to go and deal with Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy. And he came to realize that accepting death wasn't something he was only going to have to do during wartime. He came to realize that when he looked at the dire future implicated by climate change, this stuff that I've summarized earlier, that this civilization, this way of life, it's on its way to death too. And that if we want to get on with what it is to be human and whatever work that we're going to have to do as humans in this time, taking care of each other, that we need to accept and let go of this way of life too. Because it's already over. We're going to reach levels where things are going to change radically. And this is a response that I can deal with because I can accept that this is not the only or probably even the best, given how things have turned out, way of being human. And that we're at the start of something new. So that was a useful process for me to go through, and I'm covering a lot of ground here, so maybe it's not for everybody. But in any case, if we accept how the world is and how it's going to become, if we're okay with setting aside hope, then we have to start thinking about how we're going to live, because we still have that choice. You know, are we going to run away if we could? Are we going to end our lives? Are we going to eat, drink, and make merry? How we live in the world we are in now and the one that we're created, that's on its way, is something we have to deal with. So where do we find our direction? And I want to mention or turn to this essay by a fellow named Paul Keeling that I thought was really, really useful as well. It's called Come Hell and High Water. It's really good, and you should look it up if you're interested in this stuff, because he's actually reflecting on most of the essays that are in this book, although his essay isn't in the book. Keeling and Michael Nelson talk about the missing moral premise in climate action. So the factual premise is that, and we all know this, if we don't act soon, anthropogenic environmental changes will bring serious harms to the future. The moral premise is that we have a moral obligation to avert harms to the future so as to leave a world as rich in possibility as the world we inherited. I think that's a very nice way to put this, as rich in possibility. And the conclusion is that if we're moral people, we have a moral obligation to act, and to act now. This is all good. I'm totally on board with that. I think it makes sense. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a paradox involved. If only concerted collective action will avert disaster, doesn't this mean that individual action alone won't make any difference in the big scheme of things? So individually, does this mean that we have no moral obligation to act? In other words, is this a bit of a tragedy of the common situation? You know, what does it matter what I do because it won't make any difference anyways? Well, Keeling and Nelson as well both say that this paradox arises because of the fixation on consequences alone, on a preoccupation with getting results, and not enough on the question of what kind of person do I want to be and how do I want to live in the world. In short, we've come to focus too much on morals of consequence and not morals of personal virtue. So what they're saying, I think, is that whether or not collective action is forthcoming, we still have a moral obligation to act to protect the planet because it's the right thing to do. It's really what it comes down to. It's the right thing to do. I think that Keeling and Nelson are right on with this. I want to do the best. I want to be the best person I can, regardless of the world I live in. And I want to do things because of the right thing to do, and not just because of any consequences they may or may not have. And incidentally, this, when I was writing this out, I thought this applies also to our kids when they say, why can't I fly to Hawaii for spring break? Because the plane's going to go there anyways. It applies to the port when they say, why shouldn't we export coal? Because if we don't, somebody else will do it anyways. It applies to Stephen Harper when he says, why should Canada reduce its emissions? Because China's not reducing theirs. They're all essentially missing the point that we have an obligation to the planet, and these things are important in and of themselves. Keeling said that Rosa Parks didn't refuse to get up from the whites-only seats on the bus because she wanted to change the world to start a revolution. She didn't get up because she was tired of giving in. She was tired of not living according to her values. I think that's really powerful. It's a powerful way of looking at things, and it's also a very comforting way of looking at things. Because this isn't about sacrifice or doing without. It's about doing what's right because it is right, and not because it's going to necessarily achieve a certain goal. In other words, as Nelson says, this is about caring without hope. I'm prepared to live without hope because my motivation for action is what's morally right in the world that I live in right now, not for the world that I want to live in or I hope to live in. So in a sense, over these past years, I've gone full circle back to where I was when we started VTAC, in that it is important to do these things just in and of themselves because of the right thing to do, regardless of the consequences. How do we live a moral life on a day-to-day basis? It's a big topic, and it's, you know, something for all of us to grapple with, and I'm just going to leave it at this. I think you need to speak openly and honestly to other people about these issues. You know, you need not to brood on them and be pessimistic. Don't sweat the small details, and don't turn inward. But now that I've gone to such effort to sort of talk about how we need to live, you know, a morally purposeful life in of itself, I want to tear that down a bit, because collective action still is important. We shouldn't just be floating around sustaining ourselves on acts of personal virtue, because there is a bigger world out there that we need to grapple with. And we can't ignore those problems. So there's two levels of collective action that I think we need to deal with. The first is building community. Living a morally courageous life is going to be hard work for all of us. And staring reality in the face means carrying around a lot of weight. And that's easier to do if you do it in fellowship with other people. And I think that's why it's important, really important, and valuable that you guys have this community here. We should all be working with others to help share that load. It's important for a second reason, because we don't want to lapse into survivalism, turning our backs on things and building a bunker and filling it with canned food would be the worst case scenario. Groups like Village Vancouver and the Homesteaders Emporium are both about building reliance. They're about building, it's about networks of local reliance, skills for developing a different world, and really taking care of the people we love. All these things are going to matter even more in the future than they do now. We can't turn inward. We need to be self-directed. We need to be grounded in our moral obligations. But we also need to be curious and open. And we need to work together and take care of each other. But this kind of community building still won't be enough, because we can't turn our backs on the bigger issues. We also need to pursue collective action at the political level. Because even if it's too late for a 2-degree warmer world, a 3-degree warmer world is better than a 4-degree world. And that's obviously, even though it's unpredictable, better than a 5-degree world. So we can still make a difference now in terms of where we land in this process. And we need governments because they give us the best chance of making the kinds of big changes needed to grapple with these problems. Okay? We can't give up on government. So the second kind of political action that matters is the political one. And I don't mean elections, although those matter too. I mean the messy, day-to-day stuff of decision-making and inserting yourself in the process and using whatever processes you can to move things along. And if the processes don't exist, create them. Owen in the back and I and some others worked closely on this thing called Real Port Hearings to help create a process for public input on the proposal to expand coal exports out of Surrey. And if we hadn't done that, they would have approved that a long time ago. But because we did it and it was transparent and people were able to express their concerns, the port has had to back down. We haven't stopped it, but we've delayed it. And any work that delays the destruction of our climate, even if it's any process, even if it's imperfect, is worth exhausting through to the end, because it buys us time and it creates opportunities to engage more people and build a bigger community for working on this stuff. We'll talk about that more at the end if you want. I want to say one more thing about politics, and that's that we can't give up on government. We can't lose trust in it. We're going to need it because it's the best tool we have for taking care of each other and on any sort of scale. But I think if we're honest, there are very few politicians outside of people like, say, Andrew Weaver, that are really willing to acknowledge the reality of climate change, let alone advocate for the policies needed to address it, especially once they're in power. So given that politics is the art of the possible, the urgent action we need from governments is not going to happen unless it's led from the bottom up, from pressure from below. We need to make it possible for government to confront these issues by making it a moral responsibility that's impossible to ignore. And I know that governments don't work that way, but we need to change them because these are unprecedented issues we face. I put this slide up because it represents for me the level of engagement that governments offer to us. By all means, recycle and take shorter showers and call before you dig. But when it comes to, preserving a climate stable enough that humans can thrive, there's no number to call. They're not picking up the phone. So clearly to get government on the phone, this kind of bottom-up pressure is needed. gadflies are needed. Morally courageous people who will stand up and say no are needed. We need to do the fundamental work of saying not in my name, or as Chris Hedges says in an essay that I'll reference again at the end, of calling for mutiny. Not because we give up on government, but because we're sorely disappointed in government leadership. And that, by the way, is the flower that you find out about when you call that phone number. That's the riverbank lupin, which is growing at the site of the Fraser Surrey Docks proposed coal port. So if the power elite isn't acting rationally, if it insists on digging up and burning the last fossil fuels, if government's sitting on the sidelines or betting that process, what do? Those of us who are willing to stare reality in the face are confronted with a challenge. Do we have the moral courage to stand up and say, not in my name? In the end, really, action in keeping with our values is what matters. That is politics. Chris Hedges paraphrases Hannah Arendt on the origins of totalitarianism by saying that morally reliable people, when the chips are down, are not the ones who can say this is wrong, but the ones who say I can't. Right now, speaking the truth and saying no, saying I can't, is probably the most important collective action that we can take. It is political action. But what does it look like? What does this mutiny look like? I think to be successful, there's only one approach to take. Peaceful, transparent, dignified civil disobedience. First, because it sends a message to like-minded people. This is what caring people are doing right now. This is our moral obligation. Come and join us. And second, and this is no small thing, because nonviolent movements are always more successful than violent movements. And if you use violence against people or property, you're inviting a violent response from the state, and you're likely not to win. I'm sure many of you have read this. It's really stuck in my head as well. And there's a scene in the book when Holden is sort of roaming around, he's agitated and he's frustrated, and he ends up crashing on his teacher's couch. And the teacher hears him out, and then he says, you know what, Holden? The mark of an immature man is that he's ready to die for a cause. And the mark of a mature man is that he's ready to live humbly for one. And this is really stuck in my head over the years. I don't know why, even as the language is more and more outdated. You know, I have alarm bells going off in my head all the time. I'm angry about the world all the time. And it's probably hurting my health, and it's affected my family life, I know. And I might get some sort of temporary relief by doing radical acts. But beyond personal satisfaction, I don't think that they would actually make a difference. I understand the urge to express anger, and I see a lot of angry young people who want to take action, and I encourage them to pursue the humble path. So again, I think that we need to exhaust all reasonable political processes first, but once they're exhausted or where they don't exist, we need to move on. For civil disobedience to be successful, it needs careful framing, it needs validation by others, and you need to keep in control of your message. It's not simply about acting out your frustrations on impulse. It's some of the most important collective political work that we can do. And it should be done transparently and with dignity and with respect for the people you're interacting with. I think that righteous anger is a really powerful thing, and it's good to be empowered by it, but we should always be trying to set an example that inspires others and welcomes them. And this form of collective action, probably more than any other, has to be a humble one. So, the goal, I think, of this kind of collective action really is to inspire political change. But at the same time, when saying no is the right thing to do, civil disobedience as virtuous behavior is also really an end in itself. As Chris Hedges says, resistance is carried out not for its success, but because it affirms life. When we stopped coal trains for a day in White Rock, we actually step out in front of a train. We told them a week in advance that on this day we are going to stop coal trains from running. And Brad was there, he can confirm that's how it happened. We did it not because we thought it would stop climate change once and for all, but because we knew we had to say no. So once again, I think a dignified, transparent civil disobedience is really one of the highest forms of virtuous behavior. And I honestly hope that people like you are willing to be involved in that effort, because it's the kind of work that we need now. I hope you'll consider it, that you'll think it over in terms of where we're at and what needs to be done and what you're prepared to do. I think everyone who's stared this problem in the face needs to go through this process. And if you wanted to think more about the process and this kind of work, I really suggest you read the interview of Tim DeChristopher in The Orion by Terry Tempest Williams called What Love Looks Like, because he's a fellow who I think is very inspiring in terms of what he's done and where he's grounded at in his work. So, wrapping up rather. Collective action in BC. I hope at this point, we haven't talked about the details, but I hope at this point, simply the idea of building a new coal port on the Fraser River to export US thermal coal to be burned somewhere in Asia sounds as absurd to you as it does to me. That, our government passing a law calling natural gas a clean fuel so that we can evade our climate obligations and export LNG sounds like madness. And that plans to build the Enbridge pipeline or the Kinder Morgan pipeline to the coast are just crazy and nihilistic. I mean, these things can't be reconciled with what we need to do to survive at this point. They are simply wrong. Fortunately, if I can frame it that way, we're uniquely situated here in BC to take action. We are literally on the front lines when it comes to stopping fossil fuel exports. And I think that this creates an opportunity as well as an obligation. We need to do the work. We need to work towards government action and policies that will delay and stop further warming down the road. Saying no to these plans is morally virtuous behavior. This work is important to preserve the possibility of the kind of world that still makes sense with people living in it. This is what we're fighting for now. And we'll know within this decade whether we've succeeded or not. Thank you.